this is Bernadette, and she works in library headquarters. And today, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Mr. Men series by Roger Hargreaves, I'm going to be reading Mr. Tickle and the Dragon for you today.
And I'm going to pick a surprise book, so you might help me with a roll the dice and see what we get for today. So let's give it a go. Oh, Little Miss Fickle. Let me show you what a nice selection of Little Miss and Mr. Men books we have at Dora Doyle Library.
Now, Mr. Tickle and the Dragon by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Tickle was having a very good day. 21 people well and truly tickled. A very good day indeed. But when he arrived home, he could not believe his eyes. "I can't believe my eyes," he said to himself. "Somebody has burnt down my house." Mr. Tickle's house was gone. All that was left was a smoking, charred pile at the end of his garden path. There was more smoke rising from the end of the lane. Mr. Tickle set off to investigate. The smoke was coming from Mr. Funny's shoe car. Or rather, it had been his car, but all that remained was a burnt shoelace. Mr. Tickle could see another spiral of smoke in the distance. This time it was Mr. Clever's house, and very nearly Mr. Clever, by the look of him. "I just got out in time," said Mr. Clever. "There can only be one culprit. It must have been, But Mr. Tickle did not wait to hear what it must have been. He had spotted the signs of another fire and was determined to follow the trail. It was a long trail which led from Mr. Chatterbox's burnt-out phone box to Farmer Field's burnt-down barn, and on through wilder, bleaker land up into the mountains. Soon it began to get dark, but Mr. Tickle continued to climb higher and higher. Darkness had fallen when he saw a bright light. In the distance there was a cave emitting a red glow. Suddenly Mr. Tickle did not feel very brave. Suddenly he wished he had stayed to hear what Mr. Clever had to say. Mr. Tickle decided to wait there until the morning. He curled up under a bush and wrapped his arms around himself 3 times to keep warm. Mr. Tickle fell into a surprisingly deep sleep, and the sun was up when he was woken by the rustling of the bush. Mr. Tickle opened an eye. The bush rustled again. "I know you're in there," rumbled a very deep voice. "Come on, show yourself." Mr. Tickle cautiously poked his head through the top of the bush and stood blinking in the bright sunlight. He was quite unprepared for the sight that met his eyes. He was standing face to face with a dragon, a huge dragon at that, a huge dragon with smoke curling from his nostrils. Mr. Tickle gulped. "Hello," said Mr. Tickle in a tiny voice. "I'm going to give you 30 seconds to give me a good reason why I shouldn't burn you to a crisp," bellowed the dragon. "And then I'm going to burn you to a crisp." Mr. Tickle gulped for the second time. Mr. Tickle needed to think fast. He realized his arms were hidden. Quick as a flash, he sent one of his extraordinary long arms snaking through the bushes and under the dragon's belly. Mr. Tickle flexed his fingers and hoped beyond everything that dragons are ticklish. The dragon instantly crumbled into a giggling, laughing tangle on the ground. "Ha ha ha!" roared the dragon. "Hee hee hee!" wheezed the dragon. "Ho ho ho!" boomed the dragon. Stop it, he cried. "I'll stop tickling you if you promise to stop burning things," said Mr. Tickle. "Anything, I'll promise anything," pleaded the dragon. Mr. Tickle stopped tickling and looked the dragon squarely in the eye. "What you need to learn," said Mr. Tickle, "is to put your fire breathing to good use. You should be using your extraordinary skills to make people happy. I'll show you." The dragon lay down on the ground and Mr. Tickle hopped on his back. Then the dragon shook out his great wings and took off, circling high over the mountains and swooping down to the distant valleys. They flew lower and lower, passing over barns and cottages. Look, cried Mr. Tickle, it's little Miss Splendid's house. I have an idea for your first good deed. Mr. Tickle and the dragon stood beside little Miss Splendid's swimming pool. It's too cold today to swim in little Miss Splendid's pool, said Mr. Tickle. Do you think you could do anything about it? The dragon thought for a moment, then he took a deep breath and breathed out through his nostrils. Flames licked across the surface of the swimming pool. In no time at all, the pool was steaming. Little Miss Splendid was delighted. Mr. Tickle the dragon and little Miss Splendid had a very enjoyable swim. In fact, the dragon had a very enjoyable day. He melted the ice on Mr. Bump's path, and Mr. Bump couldn't have been happier, as most mornings he usually slipped up and bumped his head. He warmed up Mr. Forgetful's cup of tea, which he had made at breakfast time and had forgotten to drink. Mr. Forgetful was delighted. He doesn't normally get to drink hot tea. And Mr. Greedy was very impressed when the dragon cooked 15 sausages all at once. By the end of the day, the dragon had a big glowing smile across his face. Do you know what? He boomed cheerfully. I feel really good. Mr. Tickle grinned, and then he reached out his extraordinary long arms and tickled the dragon. And now I do too, he laughed.
Little Miss Fickle by Roger Hargreaves. Would you like me to tell you a story? If you were Little Miss Fickle, you'd say, yes, please. And then you'd say, no, thank you. And then you'd say, yes, again. Little Miss Fickle was one of those people who just could not make up their minds. Ever. About anything. Little Miss Fickle lived in Dandelion Cottage, which was on the outskirts of Sunnytown. And she lived right next door to her best friend, Little Miss Neat, who lived in Two-Pin Cottage. One Monday, Little Miss Fickle and Little Miss Neat went out to lunch in Sunnytown. I'll have the soup to start with, said Little Miss Neat to the waiter as she looked at the menu. Followed by the fish. So will I, said Little Miss Fickle. But after the waiter had written down the order, Little Miss Fickle looked at the menu again. No, I won't, she said. I'll have the salad instead, followed by the roast chicken. The waiter crossed out the first order and wrote down the second. On the other hand, continued Little Miss Fickle, I won't have anything to start with, but then I'll have the eggs. The waiter sighed. An hour later, after the waiter had worn out 3 pencils and 4 order pads, Little Miss Fickle finally made up her mind to have the soup, followed by the fish. The waiter brought the soup. Little Miss Fickle looked at it. I'm not hungry anymore, she said. It was at that moment that the waiter decided he was going to be a bus conductor instead of a waiter. On Tuesday, Little Miss Fickle went to buy a hat. I want a new pink hat, she announced to the milliner. The milliner brought her 2 pink hats to choose from. I'll have this one, said Little Miss Fickle, after she had tried them both on. Certainly, madam, replied the milliner, and put the hat in a hat box. On the other hand, said Little Miss Fickle, I think I'll have the other hat. The milliner took the first hat out of the hat box and then put the second hat into the hat box. But, continued Little Miss Fickle, I think the first hat suited me better, don't you? The milliner didn't say a word as she took the second hat out of the hat box and then put the first hat back into the hat box. She handed the hat box to Little Miss Fickle. Little Miss Fickle looked at the milliner. Do you have any blue hats? She asked. It was at that moment that the milliner decided she was going to be a ballerina instead of a milliner. On Wednesday, Little Miss Fickle went to the butcher's. I'd like some sausages, she said. Beef sausages or pork sausages? Asked the butcher. Pork sausages, replied Little Miss Fickle. The butcher wrapped up the pork sausages. But beef sausages would be nicer, said Little Miss Fickle. The butcher unwrapped the pork sausages and wrapped up some beef sausages instead. On the other hand, continued Little Miss Fickle, chops would be tastier. It was at that moment that the butcher decided he needed a holiday. But on Thursday, guess what happened? Little Miss Fickle disappeared. Little Miss Neat had seen her pass Two-Pin Cottage on the way into Sunnytown, but she hadn't come back. She didn't come back on Friday either, so Little Miss Neat went looking for her. She met Mr. Muddle. Have you seen Little Miss Fickle? She asked anxiously. Mr. Muddle looked at her in a puzzled sort of way. Did you say have I been for a little tickle? He asked. Oh, Mr. Muddle, said Little Miss Neat and hurried on. Then Little Miss Neat met Mr. Forgetful. Have you seen Little Miss Fickle? She asked. Mr. Forgetful thought. Well, she said, have you? Mr. Forgetful thought again. Have I what? He asked after a while. Oh, Mr. Forgetful, said Little Miss Neat and hurried on. But could she find little Miss Fickle? No, she could not. Nobody had seen her. The Sunnytown Public Lending Library has 19,999 books. On Saturday afternoon, little Miss Fickle reached up and took one of them down from a shelf. "I'll read this one," she thought to herself. On the other hand, she thought again, looking at another book, "Perhaps I'll read that book instead." She put the first book back on the shelf and took the other book down. It was the 19,999th book she had chosen. Little Miss Fickle had been in the library for 3 days choosing a book. 3 whole days choosing just one single solitary book. She went home carrying her book. That Saturday afternoon, little Miss Neat was in the garden of Tupin Cottage when little Miss Fickle walked past. "Where have you been?" she called out. "To the library," replied little Miss Fickle. "For 3 days?" exclaimed little Miss Neat. "Well," explained little Miss Fickle, "I wanted to choose the right book." And she held it up, and then she stopped and looked at it. "Oh, botherations," she said. "I've read it before." The end.
So that concludes our Mr. Men themed story time for today. We hope you enjoyed both stories, and we hope to see you in the library soon where you can pick out your own Mr. Men books.